Hello, everyone. On behalf of RELO Andes, welcome to today's webinar, which is entitled A Six-Word Story, a Two-Part Lesson. And my name is Daniel Walsh, and I'm an English Language Fellow and residing in Cusco, Peru. So, as is typical for getting started. Just a reminder that we meet the third Thursday of each month, and you can follow RELO Andes on Facebook. And as is also typical, please add to the comments where it is that you are joining from. We'll give you a couple of minutes to do that. It's always interesting to see where people are joining from. So we have Lourdes from Iquitos, welcome. We have Jafra, good afternoon. Jafra, where are you joining from? Others feel free to write in the chat where it is that you're joining from. We have Yari from Honduras. Welcome, Yari. We have Luis Alberto from Chiclayo. Asada from Kyrgyzstan. Welcome. Long way away. Jafra, thank you. Joining us from Lambayeque in Peru, here in Peru. Polola joining from Ayacucho here in Peru. Give folks another 10 seconds or so to add to the comments. Okay, so with some of those introductions, we'll go ahead and get started. And a reminder that we have a post-webinar discussion tomorrow at 2 p.m. Lima time. So please join us for that as well. And you can add this session to your calendar now. Next month, Thursday, July 20th, also 2 p.m. Lima time. All right, so here's what we're going to be working on today. We're going to experience parts of a lesson that contain critical design components, and these were addressed in previous webinars, but it's not necessary that you attended previous webinars in order to take something away from today's session. So don't worry if by chance this is the first time you're attending. So some of what we'll look at is an authentic project, right, connected to students' experiences, classroom activities that have formative assessment, opportunities for formative assessment and feedback. And you'll also see an example of a rubric that is really designed to support student learning. So here's our agenda. We'll do a little bit of a warm-up. I'll tell you a little bit about the concept of the six-word story, and then we'll delve into each of those critical components that I mentioned with the previous slide. All right, so here's an opportunity to contribute to the comments once again. And two questions. First is, what was the theme or the topic of the last piece of writing that your students submitted? And secondly, how would you describe it? And I gave you a bunch of suggestions here. Perhaps it was descriptive, perhaps it was persuasive, perhaps it was creative, poetic. So take a couple of minutes to add responses to those two questions you see on the screen into the chat. And welcome, Munesh from Pakistan. Iris, hello, welcome. And I'll give you a couple of minutes to add to the comments. We have one from Polola already, so keep them coming. Hi, Soko, welcome. Okay, we'll give you another 30 seconds or so to respond to these questions. Lola has written that students wrote about their favorite piece of technology, and it was a descriptive piece of writing. Others take another 10 seconds or so. If you'd like to add to the comments, that would be great. Okay, so let's jump in a little bit further here. So you see this person here on the screen, and he's actually important for our discussion of the context of the 6-word story. So if you have a guess as to who this might be, or if you recognize him, go ahead and add that to the chat. So any guesses or ideas who this might be? Yeah, a couple of responses coming in. Luis Alberto, Ernest Hemingway, and Soko writes that he is a writer, and both of those responses are correct. So thanks for your contributions there. So a little bit about Ernest Hemingway. Yes, Leslie, you got it. Thank you. You can see that he was born in 1899 and lived until 1961. He's known as an American novelist, short story writer, and journalist. I think people are least familiar with his role as a journalist. And that's important because it contributes to this writing theory or style that's called iceberg or minimalist or omission. And I'll say a little bit more about that on the next slide. And here you have some of the titles for which he is most famous. The Sun Also Rises, A Farewell to Arms, For Whom the Bell Tolls, and the Old Man and the Sea. And I can share this with you during the post-webinar discussion session tomorrow, but there's a live link there that leads you to an animated version of the Old Man and the Sea that your students might appreciate if you're doing if you want to do work around the 6-word story or around Hemingway's writing itself. And this illustrates a bit more about kind of the iceberg theory. The main idea here is that, like an iceberg, right, the reader sees at the top the narrative, the plot, and the dialogue, right? But actually, the bulk of the bulk of the literary piece lies beneath what is seen, right? Just like an iceberg, right? So there we can think about kind of thoughts, feelings, motives, and symbolism. So in other words, Hemingway's writing on the surface, what we can see is very sparse or limited, but there's lots of room for thoughts and feelings and discussion of symbolism as well. And we'll say a little bit more about that as we get into the 6-word story itself. Okay, so there is, according to kind of folklore, Hemingway was challenged to write the shortest story that he possibly could. And what you see here is what he came up with. And it reads as follows: "For sale, baby shoes, never worn." So I'm going to give you a minute to think about that, right? And so obviously very minimalist, right? Only 6 words, right? So what we want to do is have a little bit of a electronic discussion in the comments, answering the 2 questions that are beneath the 6-word story, right? So what do you think the meaning is? And how would you describe the tone? And then what's one question you have for the author? So I'm going to mute for a couple minutes and give you the opportunity to think about the 6-word story itself, as well as those 2 questions that follow. So I'll be monitoring the comments, and we'll come back on microphone in a couple of minutes. Yeah, thanks for that comment, Elizabeth. Behind the words, there might be a sad, interesting, lovely story. Yeah, it could be all of those. It could be any of those. Give you another minute. If anyone has contribution about the meaning, what the tone is, or a question you would have for Hemingway. Yeah, we've gotten a couple more comments. Lourdes says it's a sad story. Most people, when they read this, conclude that it is sad, that something must have happened to the baby, right? But Patricia writes that maybe he meant it as a joke. It's an inside joke. I wonder what that joke might be. Some people, fewer people, when they read this, actually think that it's not sad, right? That perhaps there's a couple and they were expecting a boy, and traditionally they bought blue shoes or something along those lines. And it turned out that instead of a boy, they had a girl, right? So, of course, that's based on like traditional gender and colors and things along those lines. And yeah, what was his inspiration to write this story? Elizabeth asked. That's a great question. I wonder if it was connected to personal experiences, a story that he heard from someone else, perhaps. Maybe it was something that happened in the news. We don't know, but these are good questions to think about. Okay, so we're actually going to do some writing now. If you were to do this with students, right, what you see here is a list of the 5 steps that I have done with students before. And so I've outlined them here for you. And of course, on this webinar, our time is much more limited. So we're going to focus on number 3, and I'll show you some examples of this in a moment. But generally, the steps are just to give your students some prompts, right? And I'll show you your prompt in a minute. And just have them do, a free write just for 5 minutes. Just write in response to the prompt, right? And then slowly you start to kind of whittle that story down so that you can come up with 6 words, right? So in the past, I've asked students to then look at their story and circle 8 or 10 words that they think could stand alone and tell the story, right? And then this is an opportunity to, as they reduce from 8 to 10 words to 6 words, to also play with the order of the words, the syntax, right? And then also to play with the punctuation. And you can even do this on index cards so that students can actually physically move the words around, right? And then I have students exchange with a partner. And just like we did initially with Hemingway's story, they ask each other about the meaning and the tone and questions and that sort of thing, right? So with a focus on number 3 here, I wrote my own 6-word story, right, and played with syntax and punctuation, right? So for at least for the time being, this is my last webinar. You'll be seeing Duff in July. So one of my 6-word stories reads, last webinar for me, what's next? Right? Then I played with the order of the words a little bit and with punctuation. For me, last webinar, what's next? Right? And you can hear how that sounds a little bit different, right? It's the last webinar for me, but the webinars are not ending, right? And here playing with punctuation. So there's some excitement. Last webinar for me. What's next, right? So there's an element of surprise in that, right? Like what's going to happen? And I have some ideas about what might happen next, but it's not totally clear. So that one expresses a different sentiment. And then lastly, we've got last webinar for me, what now? So I changed the words up a little bit. I added the punctuation, right? It sounds a bit more pessimistic, I think, right? There's a sense of um, maybe a sense of regret or dread in the last one, and a lack of a sense of what the next steps actually might be. So this is to give you a sense of how you can play with both syntax and punctuation, right? And now I want to provide you with a prompt and give you an opportunity to write a 6-word story and add that to the chat. And be brave, be brave. This isn't an easy thing to do in a short period of time, but I would love to hear your initial attempts at writing a 6-word story. So here's your prompt. So what's something that's preventing you from participating fully in this webinar right now? Another way to ask that question is, what's getting in the way of you being kind of fully present? So maybe there's, something that you have to do later on that's really heavy on your mind. Maybe there's something that just happened that's really heavy on your mind, right? So think about that and start to jot down 6 words that might tell that story. And we'll ask you to put those in the chat. But first, I'll give you just a couple of minutes to start to think about your responses to these 2 questions and to jot down some notes and then turn those notes into a 6-word story. Or maybe a 6-word story comes to you immediately, right off the bat. Hello from Egypt. Yes, welcome. Voila. Okay, I'm going to mute for a couple of minutes, give you time. No, we've got one already, but I'll give you a little bit more time. I'm going to mute, give you some time to think. We've got 2 excellent ones so far. Keep them coming. Keep them coming. Daniel, welcome from Ecuador. We've got two from Jimena. Thank you, Jimena. Give you another minute to contribute your 6-word story. The 3 we have are great. All right. So we've got a few here. Jimena is thinking about her kids and writes, pick up my kids from school. Patricia writes, hunger keeps me from thinking straight. Yes, that's always true for me. And Jimena also writes, my mother-in-law next door. There's probably a lot of meaning behind that. Um, Daniel, you've written work, busy life, sometimes homework from online courses. It challenge you to write that in only 6 words, telling a brief story. Elizabeth writes, self-confidence helps to flow ideas. That's beautiful, very poetic. Okay, thank you all for those contributions. Okay, so as I said in the beginning, um, we are tying, in this webinar, tying a few of the topics together. And those are primarily, right, authentic piece, right, of student writing. Um, so something that really represents authentic exploration for students, right? That's a critical component of lesson design from my perspective. What you all are writing in the comments are actually first drafts of these 6-word stories, right? So that serves as formative assessment, right? Helps you to get some insight into how your students are thinking about the topic, right? And then one of the last sessions was connected to rubrics and rubric design and how um, that design can be used to actually support student learning and development, right? So here with a rubric that you might use for the 6-word story, right? I think that one of the most important performance indicators is the first one that you see here, right? Feelings and wonderment, right? The aesthetic. So, in other words, are you with your story? Are you really um, provoking or stimulating the reader to feel and to wonder about the inspiration for the 6-word story, right? Um, One of our participants, Elizabeth, wrote earlier when she saw Hemingway's 6-word story, what was the inspiration for him to write this, right? So we want people to wonder a bit about what the inspiration was, right? And we want them to feel things, right? So when you hear for sale, baby shoes never worn, right? Um, that really inspires for me like a lot of feelings like why did he write this, what is he talking about, things along those lines, right? um, Secondly, and then you can see the various levels of performance, right, from 5 being excellent, 3 being good, 1 being not yet, right? And not yet is important because it recognizes that students can really improve their work, right? And you will give them the opportunity to do so. Secondly, the performance indicator we have is the writing process and that they're participating in that fully, right? Um, as you saw in the steps that I outlined, um, there are multiple um, steps, right? Said that already, but multiple steps that students need to do in order to produce this 6-word story. So are they participating fully in all of that, right? And in this way, we encourage students to recognize the importance of a writing process, right? That the first draft for most is often never the final draft, right? So it gives students the opportunity to reflect upon their writing and to improve it, right? And lastly, syntax, word choice, and punctuation, right? So here, just like you saw me experiment with some word choice, you mostly saw me experiment with punctuation, right? So taking some risks in that experimentation, right, to convey different meanings, right? So here you might ask your students to submit 3 or 4 versions of the 6-word story, demonstrating, right, that they've played around with word order, with the syntax, right? That they've used an exclamation point, for example, instead of a period, right? So this rubric is really designed to help students reflect upon their own learning and to improve upon their first drafts, and also to take some chances, right, and to experiment with their writing, right. It's important that we create in our classrooms environments for students to take risks and to experiment and things along those lines. And here, these are might be a little bit difficult for you all to read, but I did do this activity with a group of students in um, the Binational Center where I'm based here in Cusco. And these were high school age secondary students, and they were at the advanced level of English. And I co-taught a lesson with one of the teachers, and I'll read some of these 6-word stories aloud. The first one is plans changed, family birth member regret. Yeah, that certainly makes me wonder what was the inspiration for that. Um, Sounds like there was an unexpected addition to the family, perhaps. So certainly makes me wonder. He lived adventures on the pages. Wow, that certainly inspires like a sense of wonderment for me. And I really, excuse me, wonder about the inspiration for that. Oh, the third one reads, nothing kills you more than you, right? So this idea that you can be, sometimes we can all be our own worst enemies, right? And I wonder if there was a specific incident that happened with this student that made them write this. And the last one reads, eating among champions with no merit. Wow, that really makes me wonder what that's all about, right? Who are the champions? Why does the author think that they have no merit? Okay, so we'll start to move into wrapping up. A very big thanks for those who contributed their 6-word stories. And just a couple of questions here to get you thinking a little bit more. Um, you can answer any one of these in the comment section, right? The first one is, are you thinking any differently about unit and lesson planning? If so, how, right? We've seen a lot of what I consider to be critical components of lessons in this outline that we've seen here today. We've also seen student writing as formative assessment, right? So, and the student and the writing process as formative assessment. So secondly, are you thinking any differently about formative assessment and feedback? If so, how might you be thinking differently about that? And lastly, are you thinking any differently about rubrics? And if so, how? So would love to hear a couple of responses to any of these questions. Feel free to choose one and write your reply in the comments, and we'll give you a couple minutes to do that. Give you this last minute if anyone would like to respond to any of those three questions, that would be great. Yeah, thanks, Daniel. So lesson plans have to be really interactive, yeah, for repeating, associating, and comparing things for learners. Yeah. Um, I read that as, creating lots of different avenues, right, for students to engage with the material that you're presenting. Yeah, thanks for that. And Patricia writes, I feel the process is very important because you get to see the students' progress and check their work along the way. Yeah, that's kind of connected to formative assessment, I think, the way that I read it. Monitoring students as they're completing a project really gives you valuable information for your own teaching, right? Um, Editha writes, I think lesson is all right since the objective is formative assessment. Yeah, I think formative assessment is critical in teaching, right? Because it gives you information along the way, right? Edith, you were talking about lesson planning in particular. Yeah. And Wilma writes, rubrics as an evaluation instrument to evaluate competencies. Yes, the performance indicators are important and they really need to highlight what is critical about the work, right? We can't grade, nor do we want to grade all aspects of students' work. So we have to focus in on what's most important so that our students can focus in on what's most important. And rubrics help to indicate to students what is most important. And that's really critical. For skills, yes, in order to reinforce what has been taught, yes. And I think that you would see all of the 4 skills in the lesson that we just ran through with the 6-word story. So yes, that's critical. And Elizabeth writes, not a different planning because I think we learned valuable information to improve our current planning. Yes, I think that we all have our ways of planning that we can improve upon. I think that's the goal. Yeah. Paula, yeah, thank you for attending, Paula. And we will take the next couple minutes to wrap up. So if this is something that you found intriguing and relevant to your own work, please feel free to join us tomorrow, Friday, also at 2 p.m. Lima time, and we will focus on lesson and unit design. So feel free to bring an upcoming unit or a series of lessons and their major components. Maybe you have the final project and you want to talk about that. Maybe you have a formative assessment and you'd like to talk about that. Maybe you have a rubric, or maybe you have all 3. You have all of these major components and you'd just like to bounce some ideas off of your colleagues to help you to improve them at this point. So looking forward to seeing some of you tomorrow. And just a reminder again that next month, Thursday, July 20th, the 3rd Thursday, and also at 2 p.m. Lima time. And there will be some more dialogue around sample lessons and units. And thank you all again for being here and look forward to seeing you both tomorrow and during July's webinar. Take care.